Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful.
Well, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the role of the communication media in the public policy process. Uh, as you can imagine, the news media and the communication media are vital to democracy and to the public policy process. This is a fascinating subject area. You can take an entire course in political communication. I taught a course on this about 15 years ago. Um, Before we start on this video, I will confess that it would probably require a fair bit of effort on my part to teach a course on mass media and American politics again, because so much has changed since I taught it in the mid 2000s and the late 1990s. Social media, various alternative forms of news, all have come to the fore, have created controversies, and have had an influence on the way in which politics and public policy making is conducted. So let's get into it. Let's look at the role of the communication media in the policy process. So let's talk about the communication media. And when I talk about the communication media, I really mean the news media in general. And what we usually talk about when we talk about the news media and politics is the media's role as a watchdog that keeps track of government. And this is the role that is assumed in the First Amendment, that the news media serve as a check on other parts of the government. In fact, an old saying is that the news media consists the fourth branch of government because it serves as a check on the government by providing insight into what the government is doing. There's an old saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant. That's sort of reflected in the Washington Post slogan that was adopted soon after the election of Donald Trump, which is that democracy dies in darkness. The idea is that the news media shine a light on what government does and provides us information about whether the government is acting in a way that we find appropriate. Now, this sort of journalism, this sort of, in investigational journalism or muckraking, has been an important part of the history of journalism. The idea is that journalists delve into what the government is doing and finding out what sort of things are happening and whether or not those things are good or not. One of the most prominent examples of this is probably the Watergate scandal during the Nixon administration, when reporters, particularly for the Washington Post and then later the New York Times and others, discovered a lot of the things that were going on in the Nixon White House that led to ultimately members of the White House staff going to prison and the president resigning before he could be impeached. This kind of feedback is considered to be necessary to citizens in a democratic society. The old muckrakers from the early part of the 20th century pressed for a lot of reforms, such as child labor law reform, pure food and drug laws, workplace safety laws, things like that. But the question we want to ask is, how effective are the media as watchdogs? In other words, how effective are the media as a form of sort of policy analysis? And it's important to note that very little news is the result of investigative journalism. That most news in an average local newspaper is wire service copy, or is a rewritten press release or things like that, or a lot of it is sports and features and things like that. And most of what news is printed is created by journalists who work on a beat system, who have personal relationships with sources. So there tend to be a sort of a mutually reinforcing relationship between sources and journalists. The question then is there more and better news as a result of the internet? When we talk about more and better news, it's important to, I think, emphasize the emphases and biases of the news media. And this section of the book and of this video is derived from work by Lance Bennett at the University of Washington, who talks about these different sort of biases in the news. And you might think that the news media are biased, like liberal or conservative biased. And I'm not going to deny that channels like MSNBC have sort of branded themselves as being more liberal. Fox News, of course, is branded as conservative. But I'm talking about mainstream, mainline news organizations, newspapers, the major television networks, things like that. And so what Lance Bennett says is that ideological bias is really not the biggest, or had historically not been the biggest problem in the news because of professional norms in journalism. Rather, the sources of bias are that news is personalized. That means when people do news stories, they either do news stories that are about individual people or they're doing it about its effect on you. This is two forms of personalization. So, for example, if there's a conflict between the House of Representatives and the president, it's often framed as a conflict between Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi, even though that's not a personal conflict. That's an institutional conflict, although there might be a personal dimension to that. An example of personalized news is my favorite example was Channel 13 in Albany, where I used to live, would say, reporting to you, News 13 reporting to you, right? And the idea that they're creating a personal sort of relationship with the viewer. That personalization creates a bias because it tends to reduce complex institutional relationships, such as those between Congress and the president, to a set of personal conflicts between individuals. You can even see this happening at the level of international news. The conflict between President Bush and Saddam Hussein, for example. Well, these are state level conflicts. They're not just individual level conflicts. News is also dramatized. News has heroes, villains, victims. News stories are stories, and they form a narrative, and that narrative has to sometimes have a dramatic aspect to it. And so, oftentimes, you'll see stories about crime or alleged government malfeasance or natural disasters or something like that are very dramatic. Particularly in television, anything with a good imagery will make it on the news. There's an old saying in news media: if it bleeds, it leads. That means if it's about violence and mayhem and whatnot, it gets a lot of attention on the news because it's very dramatic. Another bias that Lance Bennett found is that news tends to be fragmented. That we get news information about something that's happening right now, but it's very rarely placed into context. So that, for example, the coverage of the pandemic, one would, in consuming most news coverage of the COVID pandemic, think that we've never seen anything like this. And you even hear people talk about these unprecedented times. But fragmentation means that, for example, these kind of events aren't placed in context. And those efforts that have been undertaken by journalists to look at the, say, 1918 to 20 flu pandemic found some very interesting parallels between now and then. And fragmented news also means that the context in which current decisions are made sometimes isn't explained. And so it's possible that a lot of people don't really understand that, for example, the Obama administration had left a coronavirus playbook with the Trump administration. It was not a coronavirus playbook. It was an infectious disease playbook. And the Trump administration apparently did not take it very seriously, did not look at the sort of plan that the Obama administration had laid out for how government should behave in the face of such a pandemic. And the results have been, therefore, fairly poor. Understanding that might help people understand why we got into the situation we're in. But the news media have only so much space or so much time to explain things. So fragmentation is a feature of the limited amounts of time and space that can be devoted to any particular story. Another bias that Bennett found was that news is normalized, which means that the kind of people you hear from in the news are the usual people: experts, members of Congress. In a dispute between management and labor, for example, you hear from a CEO and then the head of the labor union. Some of this relates to both sidesism, which is the idea that there's always two sides to every story and you always should hear from both sides. That's really not always the case, that sometimes one side is more, if you will, correct than another. Like on climate change, the scientific consensus is that climate change is real and it's caused by humans burning fossil fuels. So normalized news tends not to admit multiple voices to the policy system. Now, how do the news media biases influence public policy then? And some way might be, for example, distorted agendas and distorted facts. So a distorted agenda, for example, is the heavy emphasis on the part of local news on crime makes people think that there's more crime than there really is, and therefore demand harsher punishments for criminals. This happened throughout the 1990s, and so it pushed the crime issue on the agenda even as crime was going down during this period. Distorted facts mean that if you have sort of normalized news and if you have sort of one side versus the other, there's two sides to every story and we have to be balanced, then you distort, for example, the value of information that suggests that climate change is not really caused by humans or that there is remaining scientific doubt or uncertainty about climate change. There is little or no scientific uncertainty about climate change, but the news in some cases has created the impression that there is such uncertainty and therefore a government cannot or should not take major actions against climate change. This isn't ideological bias. These biases that we're talking about and these emphases are based on the organization of professional journalism, not based on a particular ideological set of commitments. So these organizational biases in journalism are things like telling, quote, both sides, unquote, of the story, even though stories oftentimes will have multiple sides, or relying on the same sources, or using drama as an organizing principle for the news. Now, there's some trends in news and in what we call the new media that are disturbing for many people in the old media world. The old media being traditional radio and television and newspapers. The number of newspapers has declined, the circulation of newspapers has declined, and viewership of the main network news is down, as I'm going to show here. First, here's a decline in the number of newspapers in the United States. The total number of daily newspapers in the United States started declining in the 1970s, and it's declined even further since these numbers were created. Now, you can see that a lot of newspapers shifted from afternoon to morning publication. There used to be a lot of evening newspapers in the United States, but there are fewer of those now because a lot of people would just watch the evening news. And so those changes are reflected here. There was an increase in Sunday newspapers, and this is the number, not the circulation. This is the number of papers, but it did climb somewhat. But overall, the number of newspapers, daily newspapers in the United States is declining. And we're getting to the point where some cities, even good-sized cities, may not have a daily newspaper. And as you can see, circulation of newspapers, daily morning newspapers peaked in the late 1990s, early 2000s, but it's been going downward ever since. So fewer people are buying newspapers. Now, they might be getting news from newspaper websites, but this creates significant economic challenges for local newspapers. And this is another reason why local newspapers have been declining. TV network news ratings have been going down every year since 1980. And the audience now for the evening news on NBC, CBS, and ABC tends to skew older. It tends to skew much older than it used to. And what this trend means is that there really isn't a shared body of news. In other words, it used to be that three television networks pretty much covered the same news every day. And in fact, a lot of them took their cues from major national newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. And that's how they developed their news report for that evening. But with less than 20% of people watching that, that means that people are getting disparate sources of information. So there's no one shared information base on which people make decisions about the direction of civil life in the United States. During the same period, this will come as no surprise to you, home internet adoption has grown rapidly from about half of households in 2000 to well over 80% in 2018. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these numbers are hitting the 90% by 2020, especially during the COVID pandemic when people had to stay home and work from home and go to school from home. And so with this rise in internet adoption and in particular in broadband adoption, that is cable modems or fiber to the home or things like that, what this caused is a rise in news media. So there's a dramatic increase in highly personalized news products tailored by personal interests, not by the agenda setting activities of the news media. And this is manifested through the use of social media as a news source. About 1 in 5 adults receive their news from social media, which is more than print news. And you're receiving that from people that you know. In other words, it's reposts from people you know. only about 2% of young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, receive their news via print media, while 36% receive it through social media. What this can do is create echo chambers and, in fact, fake news. That there can be the propagation of fake news or distorted information by interest groups. And the question that a lot of social scientists have is whether or not we are able to filter and select news to fit our existing biases. In other words, we're liberals, so we only watch MSNBC or go to the MSNBC website. We're conservatives, so we only listen to Fox News. It means we're not hearing a range of opinions, and we're not creating a shared base of information on which decisions can be made. Some other trends in new media: the Pew Research Center found that the median American uses 3 to 8 social media sites regularly, and the two most commonly used are YouTube and Facebook. Now, a lot of people, of course, use Twitter, and that's gotten a lot of attention. There are other alternatives, Instagram, things like that. There's a new one that's catering to conservatives called Parler. That isn't as prominent, but overall, 67% of us report getting some news from social media. I get some news from social media. I read Facebook, and then on Facebook, I'll see that there's an article in the New York Times and the Washington Post I'm interested in. Facebook knows that I'm interested in New York Times and Washington Post articles, so that's why they pop up in my feed. The people, 74% of people who use Twitter, 68% of Facebook users, and 68% of Reddit users report using those platforms specifically for news consumption. In other words, they're not getting their news episodically as a result of using new media. They're getting their news from these new media sources intentionally. They're going there to get news. At the same time, younger generations are consuming higher percentages of news media. Young adults are more commonly using Snapchat and Instagram. The role of mobile phones in the abandonment of traditional news media is really obvious. 45% of adults get their news exclusively on their mobile phone. 85% of us get it on a mobile phone or a computer. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I get almost all my news on a computer now. I read the New York Times website. I read Slate. I read the New Yorker. I read the Wall Street Journal. I read the Washington Post, other news sources. But I don't pick up a paper newspaper anymore. My local newspaper is called the Raleigh News and Observer. I read that online. What I love about the new media is that I can read things like the Anchorage Daily News, because I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and I can go check out what's happening in Anchorage, or I can go to Channel 2 in Anchorage and read the local news there. So in a way, some of this is good, but there are some implications of these new media consumption patterns or policy. First is that declines in news consumption started before the internet revolution. People really turned away from print even before the internet, but the internet has really accelerated that. But news audiences are becoming narrower, and there's lots of fractioning of the audience into smaller groups that will use one or a few news sources that appeal to them, like Fox News, like MSNBC, perhaps like CNN. Local news is suffering greatly. Local politics, local affairs are receiving less attention as outlets that cover local news lose money, and there's less resources available to cover local news. For example, the Raleigh News and Observer and the Charlotte Observer are owned by the same company, and they share a lot of items in the news, but one wonders how well they're covering their own local markets. And like I said before, some local communities may be even losing their daily newspapers. And that has implications for the local making of public policy on issues like schools, parks, transportation, things like that are all very important to people. National newspapers are still important in print and online. The Washington Post and the New York Times in particular sold a lot of online subscriptions during the Trump administration as people hungered for that sort of national news. So all news sources are accommodating themselves to the new media environment. But there's greater attention on new media platforms such as social media as a way of disseminating information about the policy process. What does this mean for public policy? Well, obviously, the media environment is changing. The news media remain a venue for interest group activity and attention seeking. People want to get their issues covered in the news media in whatever form it takes. The news media aren't the policymakers' only information resource. John Kingdon, in his book, Agendas, Alternatives, and Public Policy, noted that some policymakers don't think the news media influence their decisions that much. Now, that book was written in the 70s and 80s, so things have changed since then. But still, there are some policy domains where the news media are not providing the only information to decision makers. And finally, an old saying in our field is the media help to shape what we think about, not what we think. They don't tell us what to think, but they tell us what's important. In other words, they set the agenda. We've talked about agenda setting in other places in the book, but the news media are an important part of agenda setting. So let me conclude with this. The nature of news and journalism in the United States has changed remarkably in the last 20 to 25 years. For someone of my age who grew up with newspapers, the changes have been in some ways startling. Normatively, we're deeply concerned about whether people are getting the kinds of information that are useful to them in their role as citizens in a democratic society. As you read about public policy, as you read about politics, as you consume media, ask yourself whether the kinds of information that people are getting from the information sources they turn to are useful to people, useful to policymakers, and useful to our system as it decides how to address major public problems.
Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomburkland.com or visit my website, tomburkland.com. Thanks again for watching.